afternoon. I'm Yael, Ksander, Communications Director for the City of Bloomington. Thank you for joining us for another Town Hall discussion from City Hall, where we are recognizing 2019 as the Year of Food. That's something we can all get behind, right? Food is often a topic of discussion at this time of year. We may have indulged a little too much over the holidays, aiming to cut back, but this year we're seeing a little different picture. If you're listening to the news, you may have heard about federal workers in Washington standing in food lines, trying to get a meal. They haven't been paid in weeks, or maybe the government shutdown is affecting farmers' subsidies or those who depend on SNAP benefits to put food on the table. So many of us in one of the world's wealthiest countries are just a paycheck or a government action away from food security. So we'll talk today about that very fragile food network and the local effort to make it more resilient right here, both to address hunger and to boost the local and regional economy. Joining the conversation today, we have a lively group, starting with Mayor John Hamilton, also the city's Assistant Director of Sustainability, Salamack, and several members of the IU and the Bloomington community who have partnered in this initiative, the Year of Food for 2019. So I'll introduce everyone in just a second. But starting with the mayor and Autumn, tell us where the idea for the Year of Food came from and what its goals are.
So let me, first of all, y'all look comfortable. You're kind of tight in there. So we got a cozy crew here on the couch we'll hear from. You know, Bloomington has been a community that cares a lot about sustainability, right, for years. My administration, last 3 years, we've cared a lot about sustainability, and we think about that from the three legs. I was the first chair of the Commission on Sustainability for the city many moons ago. And you think about the environment and sustainable environment that our community lives in a way that we protect the environment, enhance it, make it a sustainable engagement and relationship with the environment. The economy is a second leg, that our economy is a sustainable economy and has these all linked together. It has positive impact over the long haul. And then the equity stool of trying to make sure, as in our community, that we are sustainably protecting justice and fairness and equity and things. And it's interesting to me, food kind of hits all of that, right? It kind of is one of these things that orbits in all of those areas, from the economy to the environment to equity. And so this idea of a year of food came, and Autumn can share the details, but we have our first real adopted detailed sustainability plan for the city, which fantastic work from Autumn and the wider community, dozens, scores of people who helped do that. And you kind of grab chapter 4, I guess, right? Food for 2019. And who doesn't like food? But it's a powerful integrator of thinking about all three of those things at once to me. And so I appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you said that exactly right. I mean, we have been looking at food and looking at how we can really bring chapter 4 of the Sustainability Action Plan to life. So we worked with community partners, including all three of our guests today, over the series of 2 months to really talk about where the challenges and opportunities were within the community related to sort of environmental, social, and economic elements of our food system. And we identified 3 goals for the community related to increasing healthy access to local healthy food for everybody. So equitable access to resources across the community, looking at increasing the amount of food that's produced in gardens of any type, and then lastly, increasing economic opportunities to better connect our local growers with institutional buyers. So we thought about this Year of Food as a way to really kickstart that conversation and really amplify the existing efforts that are already taking place within the community through a lot of great organizations and social service providers, but to really help communicate to our constituents, you know, what does equitable access to food look like? How are we working on it as a community, and how can we do better? And what are some of those underlying issues associated with food insecurity? And then secondly, how can we really try to improve economic sustainability for our local growers and our food system and how can we really try to build that. So it's been a kind of a conversation going on for a while, but we're really excited to kick this off and to also do some like education and outreach to the community, have some special events throughout the year to really talk about our food system and food waste and source reduction and a number of exciting topics.
We're doing all this without food in front of us, though. I don't
Right.
any food in
Marked absence.
I mean, it's great to hear food.
Who was supposed to bring the appetizers? Well, so it's a big job coordinating all of the goals and the projects of this year of food initiative. That job is going to be that of the value chain coordinator. Now, this position, which hasn't yet been hired, but it's in the process right now, is partly funded through a U.S. Department of Agriculture grant, on which another of our guests was the lead. That's Jodee Ellett. To my left here, the community engagement person with the IU Sustainable Food Systems Science Initiative. That's a mouthful. Tell us a little bit about the origins of this grant, why you thought that a value chain coordinator was going to bring the pieces of this puzzle together.
Yeah, thank you. Ryan, actually, over, I'll toss it down there,
Sure.
From the Bloomington Food Policy Council, they've done some work looking at what would help a food and farm economy in the Bloomington area, and had an intern from IU sort of look at these various options of a food innovation district, a food hub, or this concept of a value chain coordinator. And that idea of putting someone in the food system to start building this network, to strengthen a network, is something that the USDA was exploring with the Wallace Center as a public-private partnership research program nationally. And so I talked with them, and then we started talking for the city, and I also knew some other partners in Indiana who wanted to explore this idea as well. And so this grant is through the USDA Local Food Promotion Program grant. And it really wants to focus, that grant, the spirit of the grant focuses on the supply chain and really building the capacity in the supply chain to make local and regional food systems happen for consumers in those locales. And so what is it in the food system? What are the missing parts? What's the missing knowledge? What are the missing activities? What can we put together to increase the economic activity around this? And so there will be 4 value chain coordinators. The city has 1. And so it's an interesting concept. So the city probably doesn't buy a lot of food, right? And the value chain
Not as
coordinators...
much as IU.
Right, exactly. So, but who are the players in town that do buy a lot of food? And we need to think creatively about our buyers. They're, a lot of our large public institutions, our county school system, and some towns actually run city-based school systems. And so how can we model the type of activities that could be replicable in other locations, not just in Indiana, but in the Midwest, and sort of an environment where we have a lot of agriculture, we have a lot of access to agricultural lands. Farmers may be looking for new options for diversification. Consumers are looking for different options, sort of driving change in the food system. And so how can this sort of put all those pieces of the puzzle into place while increasing that supply of local and regional foodstuffs into the system?
So really serving
that
as
was
a
the
matchmaker of sorts between those big
So this
institutional
personal,
buyers and then the local growers and distributors.
Right.
And I'm sorry to step on you. We have such valuable insight here in this room. Let me introduce our other discussion members at this point. Steve Thomas here is the Self-Sufficiency Center Program Director from Monroe County United Ministries. And then on the far end of the sofa there is Ryan Conway, the Board Secretary for the Center for Sustainable Living, which runs the Winter Farmers Market, by the way, and the chair of the Bloomington Food Policy Council. Now, you've been in charge of or leading the statewide food policy network, is that correct? And so it sounds like we already have a pretty good system as a base. Is that correct, to kind of launch this next level of connectedness?
I think that's correct, and I think that the base especially in terms of the Food Policy Council, could only be stronger. The more partners we bring into the table, the stronger we're going to get, the more initiatives we can run, the more programs we can launch. But I also wanted to say that what's brilliant about bringing in a food value chain coordinator is that it shifts a focus to what we already have. Bloomington is a food city. We've been a food city for a long time. I mean, the Center for Sustainable Living was running a food project for 20 years, 1998 to 2009, getting food from Hoosier Hills Food Bank to families that needed it. We started this idea, we had an intern for the summer, thanks to Bill Brown in the Office of Sustainability, and we put her on like skunk works projects, like what's like the hardest thing we can imagine doing, like an infrastructure project, like a food hub, let's build this place. Well, but it turns out that actually would have been a bad investment at the time, because what we have a lot of is resources here and now, so we need social infrastructure. We have so many vivified, active players in this community that someone going around connecting the pieces of that web can give us what we need to launch all sorts of projects and maybe get us to a place, if we need it, of having something like a food hub in the future or a food innovation district. But right now we have so many good things going on right here that just someone to piece this all together is it's a brilliant social infrastructure.
You're using some terms that might be new to people. Food hub, what does that actually mean? And also food innovation district?
Sure.
What on earth?
So they're kind of the same thing, but not, and I'll explain that briefly. So basically a food hub aggregates either producers, like local produce, or value-added products to local produce, and creates a central distribution point either for retailers or sometimes they can incorporate wholesale. And then a food innovation district is like a city district, like the Bloomington Arts District, but it focuses on giving incentives to local food businesses to come and congregate there, maybe share resources, etc. So essentially, a food innovation district is a food hub, but writ large, like over a larger area, larger space, more buildings involved, tax incentives, this kind of thing. Whereas a food hub is more just like a distribution, an aggregation center.
I remember we talked about a food hub, and I've been really interested in that because I learned about that idea that you're connecting the supply and the demand. But it is interesting that we've kind of migrated and said that's not the right thing to start with. As you said, we have so much going on right now. Don't spend our money to build a building and do that, at least till we figure out maybe we don't need it. I don't know, maybe we do.
And if you build it, they may not come.
Right,
Which has happened. What happens with the food hub.
It can happen.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I'm excited that it's, just really smart people think about how to make this happen. That's a good thing.
Well, we do have this intense food culture here. People, I remember a cartoon that someone had on their refrigerator that said something like, "Face it, Marge, you're an arugula gal in an iceberg town." Well, I think we're in an arugula town, but then there's the other end of the spectrum. There are lots of people who struggle to put food on the table. Maybe, Steve, you can tell us more about need in our community.
Sure, yeah.
From your perspective at the Monroe County United Ministries.
Right, so our Monroe County United Ministries, MACM, is a nonprofit that deals with food insecurity among other issues. And that's what I'm doing here today. So I can speak to some of that. The poverty rate in Monroe County, you see it between 20 and 25%. And a lot of people are quick to jump and point out that, hey, that includes our student population, which is true. But I would challenge the assumption that no students are food insecure. We have Crimson Cupboard, which is a food pantry that opened primarily to serve IU students on campus just last year.
Crimson Cupboard.
Crimson Cupboard.
I didn't know about that.
Not a MACM program, totally independent. But in any case, and also college students aren't eligible for SNAP benefits. Most of them aren't.
And SNAP benefits, let's review that.
Yep, SNAP. So SNAP is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's federal. It used to be food stamps.
Known as food stamps.
Exactly.
Formerly
known as food stamps, and even presently most people colloquially still call it food stamps. So anyway, 20 to 25% poverty. The United Way puts out a community needs assessment about every 10 years. So the most recent one they did was in 2012. And the findings from that found that 42% of survey respondents reported that running out of money at the end of each month to cover essential needs was either a major or a minor concern. It's about split halfway down between major and minor, so Again, 42%, that's
a lot.
almost half of the people in our community.
Yeah.
And they're responding that it's essential needs at the end of the month. So we're talking about shelter and food and utilities, transportation, very basic stuff. So food security definitely more widespread than you might think. At Mackham's, we operate a food pantry. We serve about 225 families a month. We would serve many more if we had enough supply to do more. Our pantry is restricted to 1 visit per month, although there are other great pantries in town like Mother Hubbard's Cupboard, Area Town Aging, that are more frequent than that. Of those families, about 85% live below 30% of area median income. And so in Bloomington, just to give you an idea, area median income for an individual is about $42,000. For a family of 4, it's about $60,000. So 30% of those numbers is scary low. We're talking about $13,000 for an individual per year, or for a family of 4, less than $19,000. So if you can raise a family of 4 on $19,000 or less, it's $1,500 a month before taxes.
My goodness.
So 85% of our clients in those income brackets. And the dominant narrative about those families is that they are not working, that they're poor, or that they're leeching. Off of that, they're lazy. Actually, most of our families are working.
The dominant narrative, you mean the wrong.
Right, exactly, yeah. The
People
assumptions
think
about those families that are wrong. The reality is that most of the families who come to us actually are working, and they're working in retail and in grocery, and they're driving your Ubers, and they're waiting your tables, and they're providing home health care for your loved ones. They're doing really important jobs in this community, but they're doing it for less than $10 an hour. And so that's something that, they have fluctuating hours, they have difficult schedules in terms of childcare and transportation, maybe working different shifts, and no benefits oftentimes. And so that's where that money doesn't stretch, and that's why food insecurity, it's a symptom of these other bigger problems that we sort of have to address if we're going to work on food insecurity.
So how does this role, how does strengthening the growing economy, for example, of growers and producers, how does that, making that strong and resilient, how does that help those folks who are struggling to put those, how do you make that connection?
Yeah, I think there's potential for additional job creation through a stronger local food economy. I will also say, though, that the value chain coordinator will be focusing specifically on that economic element. And the secondary aspect, looking at sort of food equity and accessible resources and underlying issues around food insecurity, that will be outside of the value chain coordinator's purview, but it'll be a very important piece. So they're sort of parallel paths moving forward to address 2 different issues. One of the things that we'll be looking at is where we have food deserts in our community. The USDA says that we have 2 food deserts.
And a food desert, for those for whom that term is new, what does that mean?
A food desert is an area where at least 20% of the residents live in poverty, and more than 33% live more than a mile from a supermarket in an urban area. So we have 2 designated areas. One is the IU campus, for obvious reasons, right? Students aren't really earning an income. And the second one includes the Broadview, Southern Pines, Sunflower Gardens, Rockport Hills, and Evergreen Village neighborhoods. The Bloomington Food Policy Council has also done some additional research and identified, Crestmont, Reverend Butler, Walnut Woods, Maple Heights, and Broadview as being populations at particular risk for food insecurity. So, yes, we're looking at how we can, sort of bringing in local food to the local large institutional buyers, but we're also looking at how do we make access to food in general, any type of food, more available and more readily available in some of these target neighborhoods where we know there's high levels of poverty and we have far distances for people to travel to get to an institution that might be selling fresh, perishable goods.
Right, and I think that's a really key thing to point out, those sort of 2 parallel paths. You have this macro approach where you're looking at the food systems and the supply chain and how we can get more local fresh food into our community. And then we're also looking at the micro level and looking at how consumers make choices, what choices are actually available to consumers. And for the people that we see in the population that we work with, those choices are severely restricted by a lot of the other factors that I sort of alluded to in the last comment. So it's good to acknowledge that there are those two realities that you're trying to work on. You have to sort of do it at the same time.
Steve, you made a great comment earlier before we went on live about how you would like to bring options to the table,
Sure.
healthier options.
Right.
Right now, the way that the economy works and the way that fast food works and our system, because of subsidies, et cetera, you can get a McDonald's hamburger that's going to fill you up, or any company's hamburger
Sure.
that's going to fill you up for $1. And given how little time we have, how little money we have, et cetera, we're going to go for that. You said, why can't a kale and quinoa wrap
Sure.
be equally accessible?
Right, I think there's this dream scenario that's what I was sort of alluding to, where if you put those two plates in front of somebody, and all things equal, there's no work to put into either one, it's just you're serving them. The consumer preference, the sort of behavior change that we're looking for to get people to choose the thing on the right, the kale and quinoa wrap, as opposed to the hamburger, that's sort of a separate issue than how those two things get to be equal choices in front of people in the first place. And so if people don't have the ability to make that, if that choice is an illusion, then it doesn't matter what their preference would be. They're restricted by other factors, and that's something that we just can't ignore. We can't start to work on people's consumer preferences until we stabilize their financial reality.
And also make the production of quinoa and kale maybe easier,
Right.
and not specialty crops. I guess the whole
And I feel like
monoculture and everything is maybe
That's the
Jodee speaks to
expertise
that.
of the folks on my left and right. So,
Right.
for
So
sure.
incentivizing farmers to grow things like kale and quinoa, right? Isn't that part of what we're talking about?
Yeah, having strong markets for farmers is always something that factors into their decision when making change. And so the stronger markets we can create, especially through the value chain coordinator position, we're talking about farmers of scale. We're looking at wholesale. Generally, wholesale prices are not farmers market prices, and so you're adding a mix of product into the market that's not just fruits and vegetables, but locally grown foodstuffs that are grown at enough scale where you're starting to get to the prices where consumers can manage better. And to your point, and Autumn's point, the terminology around food desert has shifted a little into something more like, it's called healthy food access. And there's actually a national mapping website for healthy food access. And the reason we have these issues with healthy food access is we may have 105 retailers that accept SNAP in our community, but only a few of them are actually grocers with healthy food. And so you have pharmacies, convenience stores that are accepting SNAP, and people are doing food shopping there. Well, if you've ever looked at the prices of food, your SNAP dollars, first of all, don't go very far. It's not buying healthy food. And so that the consolidation in the food industry, where we've seen Marsh closures all over Indiana, we've seen basically if a grocery store is not making enough profit in an area, and this severely affects small rural towns, they'll close. And when those grocery stores close, that takes all the healthy food access with it. It also creates food deserts, and so communities are using really creative solutions to figure out what to do in terms of bringing food, making food available to people where grocery stores no longer exist, and so that it's convenient with the time schedules, it's convenient with culturally appropriate food. Are we actually giving people the types of foods they want to buy and cook at home? And all those considerations.
And that's the thing about affordability. When you talk about it, there's the raw cost of the items that you have, but there's also these other built-in costs that we don't necessarily think about on the surface, like the amount of time that it takes to prepare something at home, or the energy that it takes after you've worked 2 jobs and you're coming home late at night. You also talk about it takes dishes, it takes pots and pans, it takes kitchen utensils, it takes a functioning kitchen, which means you're able to pay your electricity and your utility bill. You have to have a kitchen to cook it in, so you have to be able to pay your rent. So all of those sort of added costs, it seems ridiculous to kind of point those out, but at my agency every day we're working with people who do not have those things. And so that's part of what our programs do is connect people to those kinds of resources that they're lacking. But to ask somebody, here's a bag of raw rice with no instructions, you're going to go home and make this on your own. That presumes that they have a kitchen, they have pots and pans, they have the time to cook it, their kids will eat it. I mean, there's a lot of presumptions there.
Right.
And that's why you can't make choices for people, you just have to make those choices easier for people to make.
That's a good point.
I may make a couple points and get your reaction too. One is actually in a book I'm looking at right here. I'm going to reach over. Kind of about Bloomington. This book, I love the title of this book, Small, Gritty, and Green, because what it talks about, the promise of America's smaller industrial cities in a low-carbon world. And it does remind us that this city, not unique, but we have this history of industry. We have the infrastructure of water system and roads and transportation and sidewalks and a bus system and stuff. And we also have agriculture, not far from us, and the ability to move food in and out, a lot different from an LA or a Chicago or these giant metropolises. And so it's kind of interesting to think about us in that scale, right? That we have this potential. And then the second point I'd make, and just comment about Bloomington, is we also do have these big institutional buyers, like IU, which is not typical in most cities. Most cities do have a school system. We have some big employers who are large, dominant players in our economy, like IU Health or Cook or others, and connecting them and working together to say, we are big buyers of food, and how can we go at all three legs of the stool and some of the same issues together is a really big opportunity, I think.
Yeah, and it's nice to explore the options of things like policy and having a sustainability action plan, because you look at a state like Illinois, and after the Great Recession, they passed the Food, Farms, and Jobs Act, which basically said anybody on state funding from Illinois must buy 20% Illinois food by 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So they set a policy,
Wow.
sort of an unfunded mandate to increase the flow of food in their local economy. And we will see, in 1 year.
2020 is soon.
Yeah, that's right, 2020 is right upon
How they
us.
doing?
So lots of food systems change agents set 2020 as a goal.
Hmm.
So it'll be very interesting to see how these things are coming about. Michigan has a lot of effort going on around that. And so how can, having in the sustainability action plan, having food systems and comprehensive plans, how can policy as well as financial incentives drive those changes?
I want to remind everyone watching that we are broadcasting from the City Hall today, speaking about the 2019 initiative, the Year of Food, and we're joined by several city officials and members of the community, all working on different pieces of increasing the food equity in our community and also strengthening the local food economy. We are streaming live on Facebook, and I encourage you to write in with your questions. We do have one that's just come in from Ernest, who says, you mentioned receiving a grant. Yes, indeed. How much is the grant? Is there a local match? And if so, how much? And how long will the grant last? And let's maybe reiterate for those who are joining us what the grant is all about.
So the grant, the total is a little over $500,000 from the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and as part of that money's there's a match requirement for the grant. They want people to have some skin in the game when they're awarding these grants, and the City of Bloomington agreed to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, so our value chain coordinator, the grant is providing $22,000 a year for salary and travel, and then we're matching it with $20,000 a year over the course of a 3-year grant period. So the grant goes until September of 2021.
Yes.
And so the other $500,000, the rest of that $500,000, that's going to be distributed among the 4 positions around the state, is that correct?
So there's the 4 positions, 4
Yeah.
value chain coordinator positions that are funded for 3 years. The second part of that grant is to increase the ability for fruit and vegetable growers to receive food safety training, because we now have the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is a larger barrier for growers of fresh fruits and vegetables, and the value chain coordinator research that had already gone on found that as a continual stumbling block, so I added that component into the grant. And then the third part of the grant will be conducted by our partners at Purdue University in the food science department. Dr. Betty Fang will be working on building food safety program for users of like kitchen shares or home-based vendors at the farmers market, so that to ensure more food safety in the food supply, whether you're looking at wholesale for retail and using a kitchen share like at One World, or you're producing for the farmers market under the home-based vendor rules.
Like a
in
food
Indiana.
innovation district. You got IU and Purdue to work together in this grant, huh? Pretty good. Okay. I know that's not that hard.
Yeah.
That's good.
Not always rivals. Well, we've talked about need, and we've talked about putting the pieces of the puzzle together. What about the farmers? You know, I heard a report just the other day about how dairy farmers in Indiana, for example, are finding it increasingly difficult to stay in business. What's life like for the small farmer? Maybe Ryan, you can speak to that. You've had, you farm yourself, for one thing. I know Jodee.
I might
you
field
too.
this a little bit with Jodee. I think she actually had a little bit more experience. We're just starting out at Fable Farms, Indiana. My wife and I got a small 5-acre property just northeast of town. We're very excited. Thank you very much.
Jodee, you farm too.
But Jodee did get farming experience as well.
The farmers that you deal with, say, who are vending at the Bloomington Winter Farmers Market.
Sure, yes.
What are they telling you? It's probably not entirely sustainable to depend on me coming around and buying $7 worth of turnips every once in a while, right? So
You're probably right about that. Yeah. So yeah, the Bloomington Winter Farmers Market is a long-standing project of the Center for Sustainable Living. It happens December through the last week in March. It's at the Harmony School on 2nd Street by 2nd and Woodlawn. And it features a lot of local vendors and some who have value-added products. But you know, some of the informal chatter that I'll hear from some of our farmy friends is really that, you know, most of the time for them to be able to get a booth to market, somebody has to have a full-time job and someone has to run the farm, or they both put together a mix of part-time jobs and then both collaborate on making the farm work. So I mean, to get into farming specialty crops, I mean, it very much seems to, you have to have a passion for it, some insights into it, and be willing to bend your life around it. Because I don't think that the average market farmer is holding down their family income just through like the Winter Farmers Market, for example.
So it's a labor of love.
Indeed.
And then there is also this issue, you talked about specialty crops, and I think maybe a lot of people wouldn't realize that growing these unusual things, as opposed to corn or soybeans, like vegetables, they are to some children who may be forced to watch, well, as opposed to these monoculture things like soybeans and corn, are less, it's less profitable, or you can barely make a living at all growing, say, tomatoes or aforementioned products like arugula and kale.
Well, Jodee, you talked about the scale issues, right? And if IU is going to start buying lettuce, they're going to buy a lot of lettuce.
Yeah, so here's an example.
Right.
So let's say Indiana University is buying $18,000 worth of, and these are not real numbers, but let's say they're buying $18,000 worth of lettuce over a 3-month time period. If even half of that is purchased from a local farmer, that's a $9,000 income for even a small farm, and that's a good sale. That's a really good sale for a small farm. Supplying, you know, the majority of product for institutions is a scale of farming that's much bigger, and so farming, you know, just has economies of scale like a number of industries, and so seeing, having the equipment to reduce labor costs and to increase efficiency on your farm always improves your bottom line when it comes to agriculture, and so enabling farmers to have, of that scale, to have stable regional markets. Sometimes regional large retail buyers can be fickle, or, you know, let's say if you're selling to a certain grocery store retailer, if you didn't make 10 cases, they don't want it at all. So that's really hard for us.
Don't bring me 8.
Don't
I
bring
just
me
don't
8,
want any.
I want 10, and not more than 10, you know, so it's really hard for some farms, and with weather variability, you're actually, you know, it's a risky business, farming, and so farmers have the appetite for it, and they try and minimize risk. Having stable markets can help with that a lot.
I will mention just briefly about sort of connecting food access to some of the things we're talking about now. At the Winter Farmers Market, there's the Food to Family Fund, or Farm to Family Fund, excuse me, and they're a local nonprofit that purchases leftover food from the market from local farmers and local producers, and then distributes that food to a number of nonprofits around Bloomington, such as Mother Hubbard's Cupboard, Community Kitchen, and so we are getting some of that local food. We, meaning they, are getting some of that local food that otherwise would go unsold to local, people who are experiencing food insecurity. So that's a really cool model, and it's a great thing to do. They also do SNAP doubling at the Winter Farmers Market, so that's a way that folks with those SNAP benefits, the food stamps, can stretch that money a little further, and of course it's done at the Summer Farmers Market in Bloomington as well. So that's a really great program.
I bet most people don't know that.
Yeah, that bears
The
repeating.
food stamps
Yeah,
SNAP is doubled.
You can double your food stamps at either the Winter Farmers Market or the Summer Farmers Market in Bloomington, which is pretty amazing. The government shutdown, like you mentioned at the very beginning, is affecting SNAP benefits. So folks in Indiana are receiving their February benefits early. They're receiving them this week and are expected to budget them out through the end of next month. There's no plan for future distributions if the shutdown continues, and so that's something. I have a platform, so I'm going to advocate for that, so that people know if you are receiving SNAP benefits and you see some additional funding in your balance this week, those are your February funds. So please budget, be careful, and know that there is no certain future about March distributions or anything further. So, very scary time. It's 50 million Americans that are on SNAP. So.
And what's
And
ironic
13 million Hoosiers.
is that, farmers may be qualifying for SNAP benefits. I assume.
I would imagine there are
So,
some.
yeah, that's an ironic piece. We have another question from Ernest, who's watching us very closely. Thank you, Ernest, who asks, how many market farmers do we have in Monroe County? I guess he means how many show up for, how many vendors do we have at market? I'm not sure. And how much produce do you have to produce to be considered a market farmer?
Good
I
questions.
guess,
The
not exactly sure.
The definitional issue, I don't know if I can answer.
Yeah.
Jodee, you might. Do you know what a market, what size or volume you have to produce to be qualified as a market gardener, or is that kind of an informal?
So just in terms of the ag census, if you sell $1,000 or more, you need to answer the ag census.
Okay.
That comes
You're
out.
a farmer.
You're a farmer. Right, so we have hobby farmers
Sure.
at the market, but we also have farmers who make their living from the farmer's market, but it's generally not just one farmer's market. It is multiple farmer's markets, it's other channels, it's restaurants, it's other buyers, and so that diversification of markets is really important for the small to mid-sized farmer. Often all those things preserve their farm name. Food hubs are a great example of a creative supply chain solution that preserves farm name, so that when you see that on your restaurant menu, that's what consumers are asking for, is sort of that, knowing where their food comes from, right?
Do we know how many people in Monroe County are farmers
I
who sell
have that data on my
$1,000?
site, and I have it in my book over there, but I do have that data,
Okay.
and that's, but we have a new ag census. The data from that will probably be a little bit delayed because of the shutdown. But the good news is the Farm Bill was passed by both the Senate and the House in December and signed by the President in December right before the shutdown. So we do have a Farm Bill, which is something that needed to get passed in September. And it does focus on these local markets in terms of subsidies. So we've seen a shift in the Farm Bill, which is, for those of you that don't know, that is our federal food and farm policy. Every 5 years, 76% of the Farm Bill expenditures go to SNAP and food assistance programs, and the rest of the 24% are going to agricultural related land use type programs. And so that piece of legislation is very, very important for how we spend our money on policy in America on food and agriculture. And so it really there's really some really positive outcomes. They've established a new Office of Urban Agriculture, and that recognizes that nationwide urban agriculture is a legitimate activity. It's a legitimate part of our food systems. And
Even the USDA says so.
USDA now has an Office of Urban Agriculture.
And how do you define urban agriculture? I mean, gardens in town or?
So they are going to probably focus on commercial, so businesses, farm businesses that take place in an urban setting. And they're going to be able to conduct research and give grants and sort of work with the institutions who want to do research. Of course, urban agriculture is inherently different because you have neighbors and people walk by your farm and people walk into your farm.
And roosters.
Yeah, and then the LAMP program, which is the local agricultural market programs. This new LAMP program of funding sort of sets the tone for grant funding for things like food nutrition incentives, local food promotion. So it's nice to have a farm bill despite the government shutdown. So I'll give them that shout out.
Thanks where thanks are due, I guess. So Autumn, can I ask you to, I don't know if it would be helpful to hear kind of from the year of food approach, what looks like a good year? If we have a good year of food and we're moving things along well, what does it look like a year from now? How would things be different?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think on the economic side, being able to talk to some of our buyers, our institutional buyers, and see that they are making changes and that they are increasing the percentage of locally grown food that they are purchasing and incorporating into their businesses. I think hearing from farmers that they feel like they are getting better connected, they're getting more resources to help sort of make them market ready, seeing that there is a strengthening within that sector of our economy, that would be great. I think being able to say here are some tangible steps that we are taking as a community to address food insecurity. We're not going to solve food insecurity in a year, but it would be great if everybody in the community understood what our challenges are, what our opportunities are, and we could say, we know that transportation is an issue, we know that incomes are an issue, we know that housing is an issue, and here's how we are taking active steps to address those things. Here's how they are linked to food security. And then from a practical standpoint, looking at our sustainability action plan, we have some baselines that we need to develop this year to help us really set a bar for how we'll know whether or not we're making progress.
Data stuff we got.
Yeah, we have some data needs, and we're working with the Food Policy Council on establishing some of those baselines, so having that done. And then also just looking at every 2019 activity that we identified in the plan and seeing, did we achieve it? Are we making progress? And then for actions for 2020, we're going to be starting conversations in the next 4 months about, we have these things planned for 2020. How are we going to accomplish them? Are we getting them included into city budgets, into community partner budgets? So I think just having this robust conversation so that it's not everybody says, yes, you're a food. I understand at least one element of what that is, and we're working on it.
Yeah, I think awareness is key. People talking about it. People maybe shifting their purchasing decisions. So if you want to shift to a local purchase, everybody benefits. So we're buying $300 and some million worth of food in Monroe County every year. If every household is shifting, $5 to the farmer's market, that has economic impact. So just like you can recycle at home, you can recycle at work. You look at the recycling bins at IU versus your home. Yeah, institutions can have a big impact, but so can every single person. And so even just talking with your neighbors, bringing your neighbor to the farmer's market if they've never been, introducing them to the farmers that you buy for, having that focus and awareness of your food system and that every purchase you're making has an impact in the food system. You make a decision 3 to 4 or 5 or how many times you eat a day, if you have a choice, and that has an impact on the food system.
I can imagine some people tuning in and saying, well, what on earth? We live in the 21st century, people. That's what mechanization is all about and technology. I don't have to go out and have a victory garden in my backyard. That's why we have these large subsidiaries that are distributing food in trucks on highways around. Why on earth are we reinventing the wheel here? You guys are advocating something that sounds like it's from the Depression, Why on
Well,
earth
I
is this
would-
advantageous?
I would argue that local food farmers have been innovating for a very long time, and the community-supported agriculture model where you're getting vegetables delivered or meat and flowers and anything else delivered straight to your door is, oh, well, that's all really interesting now that Amazon owns Whole Foods, but local food farmers have been doing it for decades. And that model, that concept, it actually improves eating habits. So we know that, and local food farmers are selling online. They've been selling online for years. We're just hoping that Amazon makes it happen more often.
And if you talk about like the dangers of having sort of this consolidation that you spoke about earlier, Jodee, is there a real risk there in terms of having, you know, just a few companies in charge of our food distribution in this country?
Well, I think, you know, anyone interested in choice should be concerned about that. Anecdotal personal story, we had a polar vortex a few years ago, and I walked in the grocery store and there was literally nothing on the shelf. And because after 3 days there were trucks that couldn't come into town. This wasn't in Bloomington, but you know, and that's interesting, right? So if a town is interested in self-sufficiency or being resilient, sort of diversifying your food portfolio, just like you're sort of told to diversify your investment portfolio. Businesses certainly know, food businesses actually know to diversify. So large food businesses are actually buying smaller brands so that they can reach into all these different market channels for consumers. And so every diversification is sort of key to sustainability of a lot of things.
So your number of 300 million, I'm just thinking if you had a 1 percentage point shift in that, that's $3 million new purchase locally here.
Economic
That would make
activity.
a difference. I mean, that's
Huge.
not
Huge.
nothing. That's
Mhm.
would make a big difference of a 1% shift. If you shifted 10%,
Right,
$30 million of local food
right.
economy.
That's major.
I mean, I as mayor, I do think about these sustainability challenges, right? If you do have if you have a disruption of food supplies, just like energy or water or other things, you really do. We don't last long without food, and you really need to think about what is the sustainability model and diversifying our agricultural area within 50 miles of us, or 20 miles, or whatever the right number is. Both of those, I guess, thinking about that's really important.
And from my perspective, you talk about allowing choice for folks who are food insecure. Our food pantry is a client choice pantry. We believe in that, letting people have some control over their diets and restoring that sort of dignity. But if you have this monoculture system where farmers are growing all of this corn that has to go somewhere, so the government buys it, sends it to local food banks, and then it ends up in our food pantries, and so we actually don't have a lot of control over what foods we offer to folks, and which means that they don't have a lot of control over what they're putting in their bodies or what they're feeding their children. And so if you look at the macro and see how it affects the micro, that's, from our perspective, we get the foods that other people don't want, but are grown anyway because of the systems that are in place to grow massive quantities of food and ship them in all over the country, which then undermines local economies and local farmers.
So the work that both of you all are doing to forge those connections between people in need and healthier, more diversified food choices that are locally produced.
Yeah, I can speak in a little bit of a cumbersome way about food banks and how their systems works. They bid on the products that they receive, and some products that they bid on actually earn them credits. It's a negative bid. And so you look at something like sheet cakes or donuts or perishable sweet, junk foods, things that we not necessarily want to have. But if a food bank purchases those items, it actually earns them more credits that they can then use to purchase something that's more desirable to providers like Macam. And so you see some of those systems at work in the things that are available at food banks, not just Hoosier Hills, of course. It's all food banks. It's a nationwide network that system is in place for. And so you do see some of those macro policies affecting the micro choices. Talk about consumer choice and consumer preference. That presumes that your consumer has a choice. Food insecure people may not. Nobody wants to come to our food pantry. But when they come, what's available, the choices that they have there, are largely dependent on these large industrial complexes and policies that we have in place in terms of what food trickles down to the neediest families.
Well, we have a really active audience here, and it's great that you all are watching. We're live from City Hall talking about the Year of Food 2019 with Mayor Hamilton and Sustainability Director Autumn Salamack and members of our community. Thanking everyone for your questions, and we have quite a few. Kate asks, can anyone talk about IU's Real Food Challenge and the IU Farm? Maybe Jodee, you can
Yeah,
speak to
sure.
that.
So Indiana University has embarked on the Real Food Challenge for a number of years. That is a policy-oriented program that's every year they evaluate about 6,000 products that are purchased by IU to determine whether they meet certen susustainability
Whether it's
standards.
real food.
Yeah, whether it's real or not real, right? And currently they're purchasing about 6.17% real food, and they're trying to set some goals to the future to increase that purchasing. And sort of when you put everything on the table, so to speak, of what you're purchasing, you can strategize what might help you increase the amount of real food coming into your system. And then the IU Campus Farm, if you drive by 10th and Pete Ellis Drive, and you see the little high tunnels there, that is a nice little urban farm. And the Campus Farm was started by Dr. James Farmer with funding from the Office of, or it's called Sustain IU now, the Office of Sustainability. And they actually sell product into the IU system. Yeah, as a wholesale grower.
Sounds like a good start. Another question coming in, this is a long one, from Iari Breseño, who says, I didn't hear the whole talk, but have you also considered promoting urban organic farming on front yards? There are some examples around the country where regular people as a community learn to grow their food in their own houses and trade or share among neighbors. Also, is there a way to reduce the enormous waste from supermarkets? Well, you can speak about that maybe. They throw out many vegetables and foods that are still edible. I've seen them in the garbage containers while I shop. Waste is a big piece of this larger conversation, right, Autumn?
Yeah. I mean, I don't work for a food retailer, but there are certainly some creative initiatives taking place at retailers like Kroger. One of the reasons why I understand there's a lot of food waste within the grocery system is because some of the food doesn't look desirable. They call it ugly produce. So some companies are starting to now market ugly produce and really try to educate their customers about the fact that just because something doesn't look like the perfect carrot doesn't mean that it's not a good carrot. And then on the food waste side, I mean, there's source reduction, which I think is always a challenge to tackle. And then there's also recovery. So if you have unwanted, so to speak, food, how do you best utilize that and make that valuable material not just go to the landfill? So we've been talking about the unwanted food waste hierarchy. So if you have unwanted food, the best place to send it is to other people. Can it go to a food bank? Can it be distributed to folks in need? The second place to send it is to feed perhaps animals at another farm. Chickens in particular would be a good one, and pigs. The third piece is to try to utilize that unwanted food to create renewable energy. If you have that place where it can break down and release methane. Next, you compost it. And we've got a lot of excitement within our community right now around composting. There's a lot happening at IU, happening on a residential scale and commercial scale as well. And then the very last option is obviously going to the landfill. And we really don't want that because it can take decades for those items to break down.
And the topic of waste is going to be discussed in the first of the film series that we are showing, I guess February 16th.
February 16th at 4 p.m. at the Buskirk Chumley Theater. We're having a free community viewing of a documentary called Wasted, the story of food waste. It's a really interesting and engaging documentary. And then afterwards, we're going to briefly bring up some folks from the community, including Brian, to talk about how are we as a community working to both reduce food waste, and then how are we making sure that any unwanted food is being utilized for people, for animals, and for composting. So encourage folks to attend that.
I'll make a brief comment and then I'll turn it over. But about food waste in groceries and supermarkets in particular, Hoosier Hills Food Bank does make several runs in refrigerated trucks to all of our local, well, almost all of our local grocers every week. And so the food bank is going and collecting a lot of those seconds, that ugly produce. Say you have a 3-pound bag of oranges, one of them is moldy, so a consumer in a grocery store is not going to pick that bag. However, if you take that moldy orange out, as we do every Wednesday when our truck comes, and then pour the rest of them in a box, they're perfectly good oranges. And so there is, some of that is being rescued in that regard. And Hoosier Hills also does a food rescue program called Meal Shares, where they're collecting cooked food from cafeterias and kitchens, restaurants around town that at the end of the night would otherwise be thrown away, and is instead flash frozen and then distributed to food pantries like ours so that we can give it to consumers. We do have an uphill battle to fight in terms of that perfect carrot theory, however, because you know, folks come in and they see, you know, this part of lettuce has this spot on it and so on, and so, you know, that can be a dangerous thing to do, is to offer products that appear less than desirable, that they're perfectly nutritious and healthy. We don't want to send the message that this is the best that you deserve.
Right.
And so we're cognizant of that, and we sort through our produce very carefully to ensure that we're not making that. So not everything that makes its way to us is then reusable. However, it's a valiant effort on the part of Hoosier Hills. So I just want to make a plug for them, and again, talk about sort of the equity of making those foods available to people.
And I wanted to circle back to the first part of the question about growing at home. And we've had some developments in the last couple of years, you know, thanks to John's leadership in the new, the CD of the new comprehensive master plan, and also unified development ordinance. It's easier now than ever to grow food in your back or your front lawn. Of course, I highly recommend that you get your soil test before proceeding in doing so. But the new master plan very much supports urban agriculture. Bloomington also has an urban agriculture ordinance that was passed several years ago. So it's a very supportive city for doing urban ag, you know, in your front yard or in your backyard. The Bloomington Food Policy Council 2 years ago started the Bloomington Urban Growers Network, or BUGN. So if you want to connect with us, email bfpc@bloomingtonfpc.org, and just in the tagline, maybe put BUGN. But yeah, there's a lot of urban agriculture initiatives starting to pop up all the time. The city is very supportive of those, and so it's been fun to work on boosting the network, connecting people who do all that urban ag stuff.
So many resources, so many partners, Mayor.
It reminds you what you talked at the beginning, what this value chain coordinator is exciting part of just trying to create linkages, social mesh or network or infrastructure, I guess you talked about. That's what sometimes it takes, right? It's just educating and connecting these pieces. I like the idea that we, you know, as the plan does, the new sustainability plan, it lays out specific goals and moves us forward so that next year is better than this year, and the year after that we just keep getting better on this. It's really, really exciting. And I'm just sorry we didn't have food at our 2019 launch of the Year of Food, but you know, we have a year, I guess.
We do, and it's been great to have you as our audience today, and I want to just quickly introduce everyone once again before we sign off. We've been visiting with Mayor Hamilton today, also Assistant Director of Sustainability, Autumn Salamack, Jodee Ellett, who is the coordinator of the Indiana Food Council Network and does community engagement with IU Sustainable Food Systems Science Initiative, Steve Thomas here, who is the Self-Sufficiency Center Program Director from NACM, and Ryan Conway, Board Secretary of Center for Sustainable Living and also Chair of the Bloomington Food Policy Council. I deserve a snack after this. I'm Yael, Ksander, and I thank you very much for watching. This conversation will be posted on our Facebook page and archived along with answers to your questions. Thank you so much, and join us next time.